Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this first Rugby Climate Summit. My name's Seb Lowe, and I'm the leader of Rugby Borough Council, and it is my absolute privilege to chair today's summit and guide you through the agenda. First of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of you for attending what I know will be a very informative session, which will set the tone for key elements of our future work in relation to the climate emergency. The purpose of today's session is to begin to explore elements of our future actions which will require coordination and cooperation across private, public and voluntary organisations to ensure that this borough plays its part in addressing the causes and effects of climate change. It's so pleasing to see so many of you joining us this morning, and also to see the variety of participants that have joined the summit. We have individuals, we have people from the third sector organisations, we have parish councils, we have statutory bodies and private sector organisations all in attendance today. And that's fantastic to see, because if we are to maximise the opportunities to address climate change, then it's absolutely imperative that all of these sectors work together. I'm really keen to stress that I see today as a start for our collaborative working, and that my hope is that we can follow up today's events with one-to-one discussions, with workshops and with future summits, and most importantly of all, with joined up action. We have some excellent speakers lined up for today, following four key themes: sustainable energy, sustainable transport, third sector involvement, and finally conservation and biodiversity. I'll introduce the speakers as we progress through the agenda, and we have allocated time to allow for questions after each presentation. So on the screen, you'll see the agenda for this morning. We'll begin shortly with a presentation from Nick Spencer from the HERU project, followed by Riddhi Kalaria from Sustrans. After the first two presentations, we will have a short comfort break before heading into presentations from Alex Becker of Transition Town Rugby, and finally Ian Jelly of the Warwickshire Wildlife Trust. I hope that the presentations and the questions and answers will be able to help us identify some key next steps, which I'll set out towards the end of the session. So to get the most out of the session, I'd like to invite all attendees to use the Q&A chat function, which should be visible on your screens. If you have any questions, thoughts or comments relating to the presentations, then please post them here. We will ensure these are either asked today, or if time doesn't allow, will be answered after the event. Similarly, if you have any thoughts on what our next steps should be, then please do share them here. And there are other ways to get involved. For those of you that use social media, please use the hashtag #RugbyClimateSummit to help us all locate your comments. I know the council's comms team will be tweeting key messages from the event, and I look forward to the further discussion that this will generate. Similarly, we've also got a dedicated email inbox, climatesummit@rugby.gov.uk, and you can use this email address to contact us either during or after the event. Through this, we'd be particularly keen to hear from you as to what you'd like to see as our next steps. So, why are we here? Climate change is real, and humans are the main cause. That is the very clear statement from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. On a global scale, it is beyond doubt that the climate is changing, with average surface temperatures having risen by over 1 degree compared to pre-industrial times. This is bringing unfamiliar weather patterns, it's making extreme weather events more likely, and it's causing an accelerated rise in sea levels. These changes are altering the stability of ecosystems and habitats, and increasing weather-related risks to people and wildlife around the world and here in the UK. The Paris Agreement commits the nations of the world to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Projections consistent with current worldwide policies suggest that warming of between approximately 2 and 5 degrees is more likely by the end of the century. This will further increase the shift in weather patterns and extremes, increasing risks to people and biodiversity. Limiting warming to lower levels may still be achievable if global emissions are rapidly reduced to net zero or net negative. But even if global warming is successfully limited, it is highly likely that weather patterns will still be different to those in recent decades, and sea levels will continue to rise. Therefore, on a global scale, adaptation to at least this minimum level of change is essential. And the UK is by no means exempt from the global situation. The UK Climate Change Act sets out a statutory 5-yearly cycle of domestic climate change risk assessments. The latest of these assessments has identified 61 risks and opportunities, of which 8 need urgent attention in the next 2 years. These include the collapse of supply chains leading to risks to the supply of food, climate-related failure to the power system, and risks to human health, well-being and productivity. These are real issues which will have a profound effect on the way that we all live our lives, and the timescales are such that the climate emergency actually becomes a very immediate emergency, with the implications becoming a reality in the short term. On a global or even national level, it's easy to become overwhelmed by the scale of this challenge and to question the impact that individual action can have in addressing climate change. It is true that we need countries, governments, global corporations and other large organisations to act, but by thinking globally and acting locally, we can begin to design and deliver a range of very local interventions which cumulatively will have a significant impact. And it's not just reducing the factors which cause climate change that's important. As I mentioned before, the sorts of global changes that are now likely to be seen over the coming years and decades, and through that local adaptation, we must reduce the vulnerability and exposure of our local communities and the local natural environment to the impacts associated with these changes. In my view, the best way of achieving this is by genuinely engaging and involving local people in our efforts. We need to encourage discussion and collaboration at a local level, moving away from hierarchical working practices to more equitable ones, collectively identifying the issues and collectively co-delivering the solutions. We need to build capacity, supporting communities, parish councils, groups and individuals to develop the skills and resources they need to take action. By doing so, we can generate a far more holistic and sustainable approach to tackling climate change, developing learning and innovation that can be shared and replicated in the process. I would very much welcome any thoughts, either in this Q&A chat or via email, as to how we can begin this particular journey of developing a shared narrative and a shared approach to delivering solutions. We recognise that the Council has a significant role to play, both in ensuring that our own practices are more sustainable and in providing community leadership to stimulate local action. Both of these elements will be addressed in our forthcoming climate change strategy, which we will consult on this autumn and winter. It is a fact that local government has some existing levers that can be used to deliver initiatives which reduce emissions and prepare communities for a changing climate. However, these levers and powers alone are unlikely to be sufficient due to gaps in funding, capacity and skills, which is why it is imperative that we work together with our partners, together with our fantastic local businesses, together with our parish councils and third sector organisations, and most importantly, together with our residents. We've also recently experienced an emergency of a very different nature, the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has been perceived by some as a more acute emergency in that the impacts and consequences have been very much immediate. And as a result, action to address the pandemic has been implemented with unprecedented pace and priority. We've seen a fundamental shift in the way that we all lead our lives, from the way we go about our professional lives to the way that we spend our leisure time and the ways that organisations provide support to those that need it most. If we can respond to an emergency such as the pandemic in this matter, then my question is, what is stopping us from placing the same level of priority on the climate emergency? Whilst a regrettable and tragic emergency, there have been some environmental gains from the pandemic, and we must not lose sight of those. I know the council alone has seen a significant reduction in the number of business miles which our staff have undertaken. We've seen working from home become very much the norm, and with it a significant reduction in commuter miles. We've switched to a digital way of working, which has resulted in a 56% reduction in our paper usage. And we've seen the increased importance which our residents place on the natural environment, with the mental and physical health benefits that they can bring. We must not lose these gains. We must look to build on them and ensure that they are continued as we progress with our recovery. The council has recently issued a resident survey, the aim of which has been to gauge perceptions and understanding of climate change within the borough. The survey also looks to begin to understand the extent to which residents are willing to make changes to how they live their lives in order to address climate change. I'm delighted to say we've already had 500 responses to this survey, and that of those who responded, 93% stated that they were concerned about climate change. Less pleasingly, 48% of respondents suggested that they understood climate change either a little or not at all. So it's clear that we still have some work to do to increase awareness and understanding. 88% of respondents stated that the climate change affected their day-to-day decisions, with managing the home, waste disposal and travel choices being the main areas considered. Less consideration was given to issues such as community involvement and financial decisions, again highlighting some areas that we may wish to focus on moving forward. An aspect of the survey which I found particularly interesting was the other elements which individuals raised as being important. Factors such as the cost to those that cannot afford to deal with the consequences, exacerbation of inequality and social injustice, and increases in conflict. There are clearly some well-developed thoughts on the matter, and we need to harness these thoughts, ensuring that the concerns are addressed through our actions. We received almost 300 suggestions of what more could be done to support residents to change their behaviours to more environmentally sustainable ones. Issues such as working with private landlords, supporting residents to reduce or eliminate plastic, improving EV charging infrastructure, educational campaigns including litter, waste and energy, and requests for more leadership from the council. Again, we need to listen to this feedback and recognise the important role that we all need to play in supporting our residents to make the changes which they're clearly very keen to do. The survey will remain open for some time, but we will make the initial results available as soon as the data has been analysed. So moving to our first theme then, sustainable energy. So on this, I'm going to hand over to Nick Spencer from the HERU project shortly for his presentation. But first of all, I'm going to give a little bit of context. So nationally, the UK Climate Change Committee recommends that UK electricity production is zero carbon by 2035. In achieving this, they recommend that offshore wind becomes the backbone of the whole UK energy system, with new uses for this clean energy being found in transport, heating and industry. Similarly, the committee recommends that low carbon hydrogen scales up to be almost as large in 2050 as electricity production is now, and that consequently hydrogen be used as a transport fuel in industry and potentially for some buildings as a replacement for natural gas in heating. On a local scale, we recognise that we must all reduce energy consumption and identify cleaner forms of energy as the technology permits. In relation to new technologies, I know you'll find Nick's presentation both incredibly interesting and incredibly exciting. The council itself has recently commissioned a baselining of our carbon footprints, and in doing so will identify the key areas of our business that we need to address in order to work towards net zero by 2030. This certainly will include our own energy usage. Additionally, the council's own housing stock must become more efficient. We've recently secured and matched significant government funding, which will be used to make our existing housing stock more energy efficient, saving our tenants money in the process. But this is just the start. We must not only retrofit old housing, but we must ensure that new builds meet high standards of energy efficiency too. Whether it's council housing stock or stock which is built by private developers, we must ensure that new housing is built with efficiency as a primary consideration. We must also support residents to access more sustainable energy solutions. In the recent climate survey, which I referenced earlier, 68% of respondents felt they could do more to use more sustainable sources of energy in the home, and 78% of respondents felt they could do more to reduce energy consumption at home. When we asked what the barriers were to managing their homes more sustainably, 71% cited cost, 33% suggested there was insufficient advice or information available to them, and 38% felt they did not understand their own carbon footprint. These are therefore key areas which we need to collectively address. In addressing these and other barriers, I know there are some fantastic third sector organisations who are able to provide expertise and guidance, including signposting to suitable funding. We must all work with these organisations, promoting the opportunities they bring, and in doing so, supporting our residents to make well-informed choices. So I will now hand over for what I think is one of the most exciting innovations I have heard of anywhere, not just in relation to sustainable energy, but also in addressing numerous other concerns such as waste management and fuel poverty. This is truly groundbreaking work, and I'm really pleased that the council has played a small part in working with the HERU project on their journey so far. And so, without further delay, it gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome Nick Spencer. Nick, are you with us?
I am. Thank you ever so much, Councillor. I really appreciate the welcome, and gosh, I hope you haven't bigged it up too much and I can't follow through. It's fascinating just listening to all of those details, and of course, you know, I spend my whole life looking at those details because that's the overarching backdrop of our technology. But when you actually hear it being presented like that, it's incredibly sobering. And I think that what the council was explaining about the collaboration that's required in order to make this change and drive forward innovation, it's going to actually be the only way we're going to be able to make this work. So it was really reassuring to hear that. So thank you very much, and we'll move on to the next slide, please. So my background, just to give a little bit of context, I set up a business originally producing animal bedding for racehorses back in the late 80s with newspaper, basically. And it was basically because the racehorse trainer was unable to control the racehorse's diet. So by putting them onto newspaper, it meant that they could control the diet much more closely and get more performance out of the racehorse. That business really just grew so quickly I couldn't keep up with the supply of newspapers. So I started a collection scheme going around people's houses collecting newspapers initially in the early 90s. and by accident became the first commercially curbside recycling company in the UK. And we transacted a deal with Biffa in 1995, where they took on that collections part of the business. I then went on to, in 1999, the Landfill Directive came into play, and the legislation stated that 50% of waste would be diverted from landfill sites by 2020. And so I saw an opening in the market where we could invest in the recycling vehicles, because the local authorities had the revenue streams but not the capital. So we invested in 180 recycling vehicles, municipal recycling vehicles. So we had the largest municipal fleet in Europe, privately owned fleet. And we built that up, and we then sold that in 2006. I then went across to America, and I found some technology that I really liked, using near-infrared beams of light that bounced off a conveyor belt. They were looking at peanuts as it was going through, and it could tell the difference between a perfectly roasted peanut and an over-roasted peanut. And I wondered whether we could remap that technology to tell the difference between different polymer types. So we did that, brought the technology back, built Pure Recycling, which was just outside Warwick. And we were awarded local authority contracts, including Rugby Borough Council. Very, very, very sadly, unfortunately, we sold the business in 2010, but very sadly that business caught fire just earlier on this year. Luckily, no one was hurt. That was the main thing, but yes, that was quite sad. But it had diverted over 1 million tonnes of material from landfill up until that point. So then, with all of this knowledge, I wondered whether I could move on to the next stage. So if we could have the next slide, please. So we basically, after we built this new recycling facility and we were working with the local authorities, we were thinking, is this really the best thing to be doing? Because the green waste, for example, was the heaviest fraction. So it was a nice, easy win as far as meeting this target's concerned. But green waste is essentially 55% water. So now we're putting on another refuse vehicle doing 4 miles to the gallon, 5 miles to the gallon, collecting what is essentially 55% water and then making it into compost. And then perhaps that compost wouldn't meet the PAS 100 grade because of contamination within that green waste. And so that would end up on the landfill site as landfill cover. And food waste is around about 70% moisture. So we have another collecting food. And so with different authorities, they will have different schemes of collections. Some will amalgamate the green and the food together, which makes it certainly more efficient. Next slide, please. So after the green waste part was running around in my head, I was thinking about the plastics, because all the time we were being asked as to whether we would accept pots, tubs and trays. And basically the market is very, very strong for HDPE, which is the milk bottle without the lid, and the PET, which is your Coca-Cola bottle, pop bottle or water bottle without a lid. Good sustainable market. The pots, tubs and trays, really the market for those products were very, very unsustainable. In a lot of cases, pretty much non-existent, really. And that's just because of the structure of the polymers. They're very, very complicated. There's obviously the issue of the black plastics not being able to be seen on the conveyor. That's a part issue, but really the bigger issue is the sustainability of processing those materials. So as an industry, the decision, I suppose, was that you'd bail up the HDPE and the PET with the mixed plastics, and then you could send those materials off to Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, China up until 3 years ago, and then they would take out the HDPE and the PET, and then you're left with this situation where you've got the mixed plastics, the pots, tubs and trays. And as we've seen, there's been well evidenced, you see those being dumped in our oceans. And I think that the unintended consequence of the directive was that we basically swapped the landfill site for the ocean, and that basically we've got to change that whole way of thinking. Next slide, please. So I describe it as like a game of musical chairs, really. The duty of care regulations means that we're all responsible for our material that we discard with no further purpose, and therefore assigning it to the waste system. So the legal definition of waste is if the holder of the material takes a decision to discard that material with no further purpose. And so that's really at the hub of the HERU technology, which we'll move on to in a minute. But the idea is that the China have removed their chair then from the game here, and the other countries will move further away from accepting other countries' waste. So as the Western world, we are creating more and more material. We've got to take responsibility for what we're actually creating here, rather than actually moving it around. And that applies to every country, not just the UK. Next slide, please. So I guess we all have a journey, and we've certainly been on a journey with this technology. The idea was to create a home energy resource unit, and the unit would be designed in such a way that it could go where your wheelie bins used to go at the back of your property. Perhaps in the future we'd actually put it inside the property. That's certainly the overall vision, but I think initially we would just put it outside. I describe it really as being the first HERU units will be like the Motorola mobile phone, if you like. They'll be a bit bigger, they'll be a bit heavier, they'll make the call, they'll do the process each time, but what we have to do as creators of technology is not create an iPhone 10 before we've created the Motorola. Otherwise, we would never get out of the laboratory situation. Next slide, please. So perhaps just a little glimpse into the future. I guess this is what's in my head eventually. Talking to house builders and engaging with them on the journey. They're also saying it's probably suits best to be outside because of the limitations on appliances in the home and the space that's required for those. So we take that on board, and to be honest with you, it can go outside, it doesn't matter, it'll all be IP rated, and then we can just have a flow and return to your water heating system. This will all become just a little bit clearer in a minute as to what that technology is. Next slide, please. So the vision was to stop collections, stop waste arisings, goes right to the top of the waste hierarchy. We do that by allowing the holder of the material to make a technical choice. They can either discard the material with no further purpose. And the best way of describing this really, I think, is you've got resources coming into your house every day. Water will come up through the ground, up through a pipe. That's the resource. You have the gas will come into your property, in the future hydrogen. You'll have electricity coming into your property. And through your front door, you're bringing in the loaf of bread, you're bringing in the cheese, you're bringing in all the packaging and the material that comes into your home. And you use those resources to live on. So you'll make yourself a sandwich. You'll eat half the sandwich and perhaps the other half of the sandwich you won't eat. So at that point, you can make a technical choice as to whether you discard that half of the sandwich that you haven't eaten into the waste system because you've got no further purpose for it, or after you've eaten half the sandwich to energise yourself, you could put the other half of the sandwich into a HERU unit, which would then energise the property that you're within. And the same with all the packaging materials, the same with the nappies, the same with all of those plastics, the cardboard, the paper. And if you imagine the paper and the cardboard, the garden trimmings out of the garden, the food that you don't eat, it's all a renewable source of energy. So as we move forward with plastics and we produce those from more sustainable materials, so your home then is running more and more off recyclable materials. And really, I guess my vision is that one day, as the children leave the house to go off down to a fast food restaurant, the parents are shouting out the window, "Don't forget to bring your packaging home." And so it just changes that mindset. So we look upon material as not being a waste with no further purpose, or not being a material with no further purpose. Now it's got very real purpose. So we need to be able to run this on a 32 amp socket, like a cooker socket. We want it to be less than 300 degrees centigrade because we want it to be nice and safe within the home. We want it to be able to deal with most resources. It'll deal with everything organic based materials, which include plastics, of course, but metal and glass it won't. So we could see the home having a collection of metal and glass, perhaps bi-monthly, so we can reduce the vehicle movements. And there needs to be a standalone water heating system that can also be scalable to put into commercial operations as well, schools, universities, veterinary practices, doctors' surgeries, etc., etc. Next slide, please. So really, we want to be able to re-evaluate. We want to be able to take the resources that we've got and change that mindset completely. The waste industry has the very unenviable position of being in the top 1, 2, between the two in terms of major injuries and fatalities. It's a dangerous business. We put staff out to work every day in the streets with moving vehicles, with people that get impatient and driving up on the pavements and trying to get round the refuse vehicles. We then transport the material to facilities that can be very dangerous places to be working and not particularly clean environments to be in. So we want to try and repurpose the whole thing, not just the way that we think about resources, but the way that we actually work with those resources and how we might repurpose the people that are out on the streets in that particular environment, putting them in, making them service engineers, manufacturing, and upskilling our UK workforce. Next slide, please. So this is basically what you're looking at now is that obviously today in the middle here, we incinerate material as well. The HERU is most certainly not an incinerator. It actually works through a process of pyrolysis, and pyrolysis in real simple terms is if you take a tree and a dinosaur and you buried it in the Earth's crust and you left it for 5 to 9 million years, that organic material, because it's starved of oxygen and it's getting the warmth coming up from the Earth's crust, bearing in mind that's down a long way, 450 degrees is the Earth's crust temperature, and that energy's had to come up a long way, so that's the reason why it's taken so long. But that would eventually turn into oil, gas and char. What we're doing with the HERU is exactly that. No flames, no oxygen, so there can't possibly be any flames. So we're basically running a process where we can do this in 5 hours instead of 5 to 9 million years. When you look down in the chamber, you'll see the heat pipes. This is a small unit. We're now going to go to a rectangular unit. This is 19 litres in capacity. We now think that with the residential machine we'll make it bigger, probably 25 litres. Especially with people working from home now and producing more packaging, more material. And so the heat pipe basically heats up, and that puts the energy up through the middle of the machine and first of all dries the material, and then it goes through the different processes. The technical evaluation unit, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment, but they were mobile units. We created 3 of them. And we put them into, they've done over 10,000 running hours in the field now. Next slide, please. So we've had some amazing engineers working on the project. Andrew in the top left was from Formula One Mercedes-Benz team, spent 2 years with us. On the right, top right, Paul Stringer, he was from Rolls-Royce Aerospace. And he took the algorithms which I'd written and put it into a language that can be put into a computer, and then upload that into the actual unit. Eventually, all of the electronics in the HERU will be on a printed circuit board, but we had some excellent advice not to rush to that and to go with a PLC to start with. Programmable logic controller, and then go to a printed circuit board once we've got all the software settled down. So we're delighted, of course, that Rugby Borough Council have had one of the technical evaluation units, social housing. Their machine came in a bit later, actually, because it was the number 3 of the 3 machines. So the first machine to go out was to Wychavon District Council. It was put in their head offices. And they were running with the material that was coming out of their restaurant there and their offices. And then we also put it into a farm shop and restaurant here in Warwickshire, and then the machine into Rugby Borough Council as well. Next slide, please. So this is what it's all about, really. The top right-hand corner, as you're looking at the screen, is where we are today. So if you've got the average home requiring hot water and heating, and we've got a collection of the recyclables and waste material, and we've worked on a curbside sort because that's slightly better from a CO2 point of view than a commingled collection system. And then you've got a standard CH4 boiler. So each home is producing about 1.6 tonnes of CO2 per year. So it's interesting when we're listening to Seb talking earlier about the people not understanding where their baseline is. This will help them understand that baseline situation. And then if you move down into the bottom left-hand corner, you'd be looking at what the government strategy is currently to put an electric heat source pump in to properties and continue with the curbside sort collection. So you're going from a positive 1.6 to a minus 5 kilograms. So undoubtedly a good swing and positive action. The issue we've got is that the electric heat source pump could only go into houses that are much more modern houses because of the insulation issues that we've got in our existing housing stock. And of course, there's always issues with the heat pumps not being able to produce enough energy when we get really cold homes. So we then move on to the bronze, silver and gold options for the HERU technology. And we then be able to give a further reduction of 75 kilos. So for the same type of capital cost, we would be putting a HERU in instead of an electric heat pump. The home would keep a standard CH4 gas connection as it has at the moment, so there would be no retrofitting to the property, no upgrading of the electrical system. And then the bronze, which is reasonably unlikely, but perhaps some people might go for the dual solution, so CH4 with an electric heat pump and a HERU. And then where we see the future as we move forward, now we're going to put hydrogen onto the grid, 20% blend to start with, and then we'll increase. The gold option is the hydrogen HERU, and that's where we're sort of stressing to new house builders, please put the gas pipes in now, during the build. I think trying to retrofit them later down the line will be very, very expensive. The developer will have left the site at that point. And so the issue is that we're looking at gas as though it is all CH4, but gas is hydrogen as well. It is biofuel. So we shouldn't just say, well, we're not going to bring gas pipes into houses, because those pipes will be able to bring the future of energy into the homes. Next slide, please. So We then got approached by the government and asked us whether we would look at building commercial machines first before we build the residential machine. That was a bit of a shock to me, actually. But then I spoke to some of the larger boiler manufacturers, and they actually agreed. So that created a bit of a turn in terms of direction. So we're now designing up the larger machine. You were looking at the 19-litre technical field trials earlier, so now we've scaled it up and we're going up to over 200 litres in capacity, and this will be to go into restaurants, hotels, schools, universities, fast food restaurants, adult care homes. We've got some very high-profile customers that are taking the first machines off us, which we're very pleased to say includes the NHS, and Siemens as well, which are a massive supporter of our technology. And so this, I won't run through it because you can see it in front of you, but in terms of payback, it's actually going to give, if you're putting it into an adult care home, for example, where they'll be paying 40p a kilo to discard material currently, then the payback will be under 3 years for them. And so we want the HERU technology to go into the business and be an asset for that business. And it also reduces the liability for the business because they're not assigning this material to the waste system. And although they've assigned it to the waste system, they still have jointly, under the duty of care regulations, responsibility for that material and where it ends up. Next slide, please. And that's it. Thank you very much. I think I'm just a couple of minutes ahead of, so if there are any questions, then I'm more than happy to answer those questions. And yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nick. That was absolutely fascinating and tremendously exciting. So thank you so much for sharing all that with us this morning. So now I'm going to ask Dan to read out a selection of the questions and comments which have come in through the presentation. So over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Councillor Lowe, and just to introduce myself, I'm Dan Green. I'm Deputy Executive Director of the Council, and just to commit that we will answer every question that we receive, although we may not get time to go through them today. We'll certainly include them in a post-event report. So in the Q&A chat, first of all, Mr. Manel asks that separate to this event, would it be possible for the participants to meet, sponsored by the council, and begin the process of making that difference that we're talking about today? So Councillor Lowe, perhaps you could answer that.
That's a very straightforward one to answer. Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful, thank you. We then had a couple of questions about the attendees to this summit and whether we would make those public, and just to confirm again, the post-event report will be produced, and subject to the usual data privacy laws, we will provide details of numbers attending. We then had a very interesting comment from Emma Tiller, who wasn't able to see the presentation, though I take it from the questions that have come in that's now been resolved. Councillor Roodhouse made the observation that the survey which you referred to, Councillor Lowe, is staying open for a prolonged period of time so that we can understand how opinions change through the course of time. Laura O'Connell has asked a question, and she said, ironically, whilst listening to this, I've just received a letter through the post regarding electoral register information. Is there a plan for this to go paperless?
So there's really straight answers to that is, I wish we could go paperless, but the law of the land as it states at the moment says that we cannot do that for electoral registration, unfortunately. But if we could, we would. And as soon as we can, because I'm sure that's going to be coming, we'll be the first to do it.
Thank you. And then Tony G, who I'm presuming is Councillor Tony Gillias, has suggested that newspaper recycling was done in the late 1970s by a Shilton industrial estate company and then used to manufacture cardboard. Mr. Minell asks a question, makes the observation actually, I'm certain from your comment, innovation can be a very lonely place, that out there among the 67 million population, innovation is stifled daily by apathy and disinterest. Mr. Manel then asks the question to Nick: how much do you think a domestic HERU unit will cost-ish?
It's a very good question. I think when we're working through these new technologies, you're working through the bill of materials all the time. Our desire is that the HERU technologies comes in at the same type of cost as other renewable energies. So the air source heat pump, ground source heat pump. So our vision is that it costs no more than that technology. So around about £6,000.
Thank you, Nick. Martin Senscall asks a question. He says, many of the proposals made in the presentations appear to be based around the current model suited to modern society, which is consumerism and buying stuff. Would it be appropriate in the near future to work towards winning hearts and minds in changing the way we live and what we value? And I open that question actually to both Councillor and Nick.
I'll go first if you don't mind, Nick. I mean, yes, I do think it would be appropriate. I think the levers that we have as a council to pull, we will pull those levers, and you know we're always looking for new ideas as to how we can sort of do something about this very serious issue. But I think one of the biggest things that we can do isn't really a lever. It's about winning hearts and minds. It's the role that we play from a communications perspective, and you know we saw. During the pandemic, there was a huge amount that we did in terms of keeping our communities safe. But actually, I think that one of the things that I'm proudest of in terms of our pandemic response was the way in which we communicated with our residents to make sure they understood the key messages. And I think that's the approach that, in my view, we need to be taking with this other very serious crisis that we now face. And Nick, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that ultimately we've perhaps got some of the fundamental measures probably a little bit wrong. You know, when everything's measured by GDP, you're basically going to be driving at one heck of a speed to down that channel. And I think that perhaps if you looked at more holistically and said, well, actually, there's some other goals that become very, very important to society, then we would value the resources around us and value everything around us a lot more than we do now. And I think that's probably something that we need to look at going forward. I think that's very important.
Thank you both very much. I did want to also cover a question which was submitted via email in advance, and it comes from Mr. Manel, who'd sent a considerable amount of information to us, and we really thank him for that. He's written to explain that COP26 is happening this year, and that while COP26 is only 10 days in November, we do need to stand up to the mammoth scale of the challenge to change behaviours in at home in the UK over the longer term. And in relation to sustainable energy, Mr. Manel asked, would the council be prepared to approach developers who are currently active in the borough and ask if they join together to bring a facsimile home to the Hall of Fame site to demonstrate currently available energy conservation measures? So I'd like to put that question to you, Councillor Lowe, and perhaps Nick, we could then follow that up by asking you if you have any thoughts or plans to showcase your technology to the residents of the borough.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Mr. Manel, for this excellent question. If I may, I'd like to answer it in two parts. So first of all, regarding developers, so absolutely, I agree, it's essential that we engage and work with developers who are active in the borough to ensure that their climate change values and aspirations match our own. And this applies to many factors. So it applies to the design and efficiency of houses, to transport infrastructure, electric vehicle charging provision and broader green infrastructure as well. We can do this through building relationships and dialogue, but we also have the ability to set out those requirements more formally, such as through the supplementary planning documents which we put in place when required. To look at the second point regarding the Hall of Fame specifically, so we currently have a cross-party working group who are examining potential future uses of this space, and utilising some of this space to progress our climate change ambitions is certainly well worth consideration alongside the other options that we're looking at. So I'm more than happy to take your suggestion forward to the working group for further consideration. Actually, by coincidence, it next meets on Monday. And in the event that this cannot be accommodated within the Hall of Fame site, I agree there is huge merit in your suggestion, and I'd be keen that with our partners we look into other suitable locations which can be used to demonstrate the current technology and environmentally sustainable solutions which are available to our residents. And Nick, I don't know if you want to add anything on over and above that.
Yeah, we've got a planning application in at the moment, actually, for 40 homes within Wychavon District Council, and it's prepared. They're all affordable homes. We see that the technology plays a very, very important part in all of society. So we get plenty of high net worth individuals that are saying that they want to be purchasing the technology, and which is fantastic as well. But I think if we can put it into 40 affordable homes and create the first housing development in the UK that doesn't need the refuse vehicle to be entering onto the site other than going to collect the metals and glass, then that would be a fantastic place for us to be. We would very, very much welcome the opportunity to put the HERU technology into homes and work with the house builders and Rugby Borough Council. I think what's really interesting actually is that what I've seen with the big house builders, they talk the talk in terms of wanting to put new technology in until you offer them new technology to put in, and then it's all, you know, it's just another appliance. We have to give a guarantee on new appliances. I think they said for 2 years, even if the guarantee on appliances 1 year. And so it's very, very, yeah, and then backtrack. And so I think if we could do something with Rugby Borough Council and work with the developers and work with Rugby with our own housing stock, that would be terrific to showcase it.
And we'd absolutely love to, Nick. Really committed to this, and let me just reiterate again, tremendously exciting presentation. So thank you very much. You've set the bar extremely high, I have to say, for our remaining 3 presenters. So look, I'm aware that there's quite a few other questions in the chat, but in the interest of time, we need to move on. But just to reiterate the point that Dan made earlier, we commit to giving an answer to each and every one of those questions. No, there will be no question that will remain unaddressed. So then, that's a nice segue into our second theme today, which is sustainable transport. So sustainable transport has been a priority on the global environmental agenda for some time. We know that globally, transport accounts for about 64% of oil consumption, 27% of all energy use, and 23% of the world's energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. It's therefore clear that we need to work together to reduce these figures. Again, maximising the opportunities which new technologies bring, whilst also supporting our residents to change to more sustainable travel options. We know the UK government are committed to tackling this agenda too, with policy decisions such as the elimination of new diesel vehicles by 2030. So what do we need to do to support our residents to make this and other similar changes? How do we genuinely encourage and support modal shift where walking and cycling become the norm? How do we ensure that the correct infrastructure is in place to enable motorists to move forwards towards more sustainable fuel sources? And how do we ensure the right advice is available at the right time, at the right times, to enable us to do this? So if you have any thoughts regarding these questions, I strongly encourage you to submit them either via the Q&A chat or via the email address provided earlier. Our recent survey found that 60% of respondents stated that climate change was now a factor in their travel and transport choices. And that's a very encouraging statistic to me, and demonstrates the desire to change is really there. It's, undoubtedly the desire to change is there. 65% of our respondents felt they could make more journeys by walking or cycling. And when asked what the barriers were to making more journeys by walking or cycling, 14% stated they did not feel safe walking, while 53% said they did not feel safe cycling. So there's clearly an issue with safety that we need to tackle. Only 39% of respondents felt they could make more journeys by public transport, with almost 60% suggesting that public transport wasn't readily available for the journeys that they make. 31% suggested EV didn't have enough range required for their journeys, while 59% said the charging provision was insufficient. This suggests that for many, the technology already exists, but how we support that technology needs to be addressed. I know that our climate change working group has begun contemplating some of these issues and have begun initiatives such as the Parks Connected Network, which seeks to make better walking and cycling routes between our parks and open spaces, meaning that people can more easily make sustainable transport choices. So it's clear there is a movement towards more sustainable travel, which is gathering some real momentum. But the key question for me is, how do we take people with us on this journey and make the sustainable option the easiest option? It is again with great pleasure that I introduce Riddhi Kalaria from Sustrans to talk to us about their work and their views on the journey towards more sustainable travel. So Riddhi, are you with us today?
I am. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to share some of our work with you and share a little bit about who we are. So I'll just put on my presentation. Hopefully you can see that. Let's put it into presentation mode. Oh, how are we doing there? Of course, I can't now see the chat to confirm. So I'll keep going until someone stops me. So yes, thank you for inviting me. So I'm Riddhi Kalaria, Partnerships Manager for the West Midlands for Sustrans, and Sustrans are, for anyone that doesn't know, the UK charity making it easier for people to walk and cycle. So we're the custodians of the National Cycle Network. So you may have seen the blue signs everywhere with the little numbers, and that network of paths that connects parts of the UK for people to walk and cycle on. So we're custodians of it. We only own less than 5% of the land, but we look after it, promote it and develop it. And that is something that we're doing in your borough as well, working on the Lifeline project, which I'll mention again shortly. We're working with others to raise ambition for active travel and to demonstrate change on the ground and to amplify those voices for change through things like community engagement. Just for people that don't know, we have just over 600 employees, 3,000 volunteers and 30,000 supporters. So that gives you a bit of an idea of how big or small we are. Let's keep going. So Sustrans, just as a bit of an introduction, we have two strategic priorities. So paths for everyone and livable cities and towns for everyone. Our charity's vision is a society where the way we travel creates healthier places and happier lives for everyone. So this completely echoes what Councillor Lowe was saying, that 60% would like to factor climate change into the way that they travel. And what was it, 65 felt that they could make more journeys walking and cycling. And that space that's created by taking some of those cars off the road does create that healthier place and happier life for everyone. Our mission is simple: to make it easier for people to walk and cycle. And again, Councillor Lowe talking about how we create that ease so that people can access it and be safe and feel safe doing so. Let's keep going. So paths for everyone. Paths for Everyone's our first strategic priority, and we launched our Paths for Everyone report back in 2018. So this set out our vision and aspiration to improve 12,000 miles of the National Cycle Network in the UK. We did an audit of the existing quality, and we are actively working with local authorities across the country to make improvements. And as I mentioned, the biggest project in this region, our sort of flagship project actually for the Midlands, is the Lifeline. So working with Rugby Borough Council on some of the elements of that, and yeah, hoping to see that as a fantastic asset for the region. And Of course, as again mentioned, the DfT, Department for Transport, invested £22 million via Sustrans in the last 3 tranches of improvements to Path for Everyone across the UK. And this summer, they have announced a further 30 million, with the bulk of this to be delivered this financial year. So investment in that infrastructure is there, and we've got that commitment from government to keep pushing for that top quality infrastructure. But behaviour change and culture change are also really important too. And these form part of our Livable Cities and Towns for Everyone strategy. So this is a slow burner slide. So we have Livable Cities and Towns we have 5 characteristics that create a livable city and town. The first one is a city or a town that has social connection at its heart, has most of what you need just a short walk away, has roots and celebrates its unique character, is easy for everyone to move around in healthily, and has clean air and green space for all to live and play in. Again, echoing some of the things that you've been talking about, what Councillor Lowe mentioned. Livable cities and towns mean designing and realising urban spaces and making sure that they have aspects of these 5 criteria to create that space that people want to be in. We see these things as really important, not just aspirational, but vital, because the way we travel has a tremendous impact on the people and places. And as you know, some of the biggest challenges facing urban leaders are connected to the way we travel. Climate change, air quality, health problems, all worsened by inactivity, isolation, and loneliness, inequality, and deprivation. And so that's what our sort of agenda seeks to address. We don't work alone, we work with others to make change. And these are some of the examples of the ways that we're working with others. So firstly, designing high quality walking cycling infrastructure. We're helping local authorities to design high quality segregated cycling and walking infrastructure, with the Lias line being one of those examples. Sorry, lost my train. Secondly, we're working with bold ideas to improve the livability of cities and towns. So working with local government to explore these bold ideas, such as 20-minute neighbourhoods, mini Hollands, low traffic neighbourhoods, school streets, road space reallocation. So I will talk a little bit about 20-minute neighbourhoods and school streets momentarily. Thirdly, working with local governments to engage residents in collaborative design approaches with community workshops, on-street trials, new road layouts. So again, working with the community to look at what they want and what they need in order to create the best environment for travel that we can. And having that connectivity to that community builds that support and mandate for change from the community. We're also supporting local authorities with their LC WIPs. So an LC WIP is a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan. It supports the network of routes that are available to that community to move around in. We have received an application for a route in Rugby for the LC WIP scheme development. So there's lots of different elements of how we're supporting local authorities with these walking infrastructure and cycling infrastructure plans. And one of these is looking at how we develop a scheme from a line on a map to a design that could be implemented. So if we've got a route in Rugby that we're looking at, so hopefully that'll be a positively designed route. And then we're also doing something called LTM 120 training. So LTM 120 is the Local Transport Note 120, and it is the technical guidance for how best practice for creating cycling and walking routes. And we're doing some of this training across the country, helping local authorities to figure out how they can put in that infrastructure at the top quality level so that people want to use it, so that people feel safe, so that, you know, that 39% of people, sorry, no, the 53% of people that don't feel safe cycling do suddenly find that they've got that segregated infrastructure to be able to do that. And we're also working with local authorities to deliver behaviour change programmes to help overcome some of these barriers that, again, you've mentioned, that people face within active travel. One recent example of this sort of behaviour change work is a piece of work that we worked with with DFT called Moment of Change, and I will mention that shortly. But moving on to transport and climate change, we're aware that transport is the biggest single emitter of carbon emissions in the UK. A couple of weeks ago, I joined a webinar on Decarbonizing Transport, where a panelist made the point that cycling is currently such a small part of mode share in the UK that even if we were to double the rate of cycling, it would deliver less than a 1% reduction in car emissions. And therefore, cycling shouldn't be the focus of decarbonisation, but things like electric vehicles should be. It was strange. It was such a bold assertion that it really stuck with me. It's not that his statistics were wrong, but that it misses the bigger picture. He seemed to suggest that doubling cycling rates was just out of the question, that we couldn't do it. But we've just seen cycling levels rise by 300% on some days during lockdown. So when the roads were quiet and safe, when we took away some of that motorised vehicle traffic. And we've evidence from our own projects that that show that cycling increased by 500% in some places where new pieces of infrastructure were implemented. So ambition should be set high for cycling and walking to contribute to the change that we need to see. And looking at the ways in which our economy is changing and our lifestyle is changing and our journey patterns are changing, we shouldn't be limited to saying that we will make exactly the same journeys as we do now, but some of them, but that we will switch mode. We need to look at the design of our cities and towns. And again, that's focused on the 20-minute neighbourhood concept, which I can talk about in a moment. And we need to look at the kinds of journeys that we'll make as the economy changes and as we organise our time and space differently. The DFT only ever projects an increase in the amounts of travel, but it's possible that that increase can be more sustainable. So this part of the slide on the right is looking at our CEO, Xavier, who gave evidence into an inquiry into local government and the path to net zero. And transport is now the biggest, and road transport, the single biggest contributor of carbon emissions, as I mentioned. But what struck me as to what he was saying is that councils, sorry, I've not got sufficient childcare this morning. I've been let down, so hopefully you can't hear the bus in the background. Can you turn that off, please, darling, and go back in the other room?
You're okay, really, don't worry.
Fab. Thank you. Good to know. Can't see anything, so it's good to hear that. So councils have the power over local transport and over local road networks, as well as having the powers over planning. And planning is one of the key things, as again, we've mentioned a few times over the course of this morning, that drives demand for transport. So there's, a great potential for local authorities to influence transport emissions. And we as Sustrans just want to support that ambition and be that support to help with the evidence base and to help with the way that that tells that story that helps drive that ambition. Just recently, we had the pleasure of speaking to a councillor and an officer in Nottingham as part of our team away day that we had on Thursday. And they have great ambition to be carbon neutral by 2028, which is just incredible. They've had big successes with things like workplace parking levy, which then helps to fund some of their public transport. And they've just got the confidence and the detailed targets. For example, over the next 7 years, they want to reduce road traffic by 1/3. They want a quarter of people to be working from home and 30% more walking and cycling. But I was just struck by the confidence and the ambition that they have, and that we all need to have that confidence and ambition, and being able to learn from our peers to be able to do that. So now I'll focus on 3 ways in which we can look to change our behaviour in terms of decarbonising transport. So just 3 sort of more tangible and practical examples. And of course, I could talk for hours on how we can look at decarbonising our transport, but I'll just focus on a couple. And I sort of wanted to bring in here, which I do bring in quite a lot into when I talk about this, is the 5p carrier bag charge. It's something that I like to remind people of because, of course, it's a different scale, but people's habits changed. I think it was something like 86% reduction in plastic carrier bags being used. But the point I'm trying to make is we need to make it easier for people to make a positive choice, but we as the change makers also need to nudge them to do so. So one of the three that I'm going to mention is the 20-minute neighbourhood concept. So this is the idea that people should have the ability to meet most of their everyday needs within an easy and attractive walk of their home. And that walkability and that attractiveness is really key here. So walking along a main road with lots of heavy traffic doesn't encompass what this looks like. And this is looking at the ways that our cities and towns need to change, and the ways that we can bring some of that need closer to home. And we saw this during lockdown. We saw people accessing what they needed in the shortest distance, so being able to walk from their houses to get what they were looking for. And so as Sustrans, as local authorities, as councils, we need to find ways to bring what people need closer to them, so that they're making less of those journeys, and making less of those journeys in a carbon heavy way, and living more locally. It's one of the bigger ways that we can look at this, but there are small changes that we can make, looking at how we can bring things closer to home. Often people don't know that things are close enough to walk. So things like signage, like a wayfinding action that can bring people closer to what they need. So I've got a really good example of this, where we were working in a local neighbourhood in North Birmingham, and I took a few of the residents on a walk, just 15-minute walk from their homes. We started in a residential street, and within a 15-minute walk, we found an outdoor gym that most of those residents hadn't seen. And it was a small, sort of quite close-knit neighbourhood, and even within that walk and within that small area, they just hadn't found this. And so we put up some signs. We put up signs across this neighbourhood to say, there's an outdoor gym here that you can use, and this is the way you get to it. So small aspects like that. There are also larger aspects of 20-minute neighbourhood concepts that I can share with you post the talk, but that was just one tangible way of thinking about it. 5 more minutes, darling. So another piece of work that we have done recently is we were approached by the DFT in February to help deliver something that would support local government and local authorities in enabling people to cycle and walk once the pandemic restrictions were lifted and people were going back to offices and workplaces. The DFT recognised that this was a rare moment of change for a behaviour change initiative of this sort, and completed the work with and cycling to work had been identified as a key policy option. They also knew that the Capability Fund would be announced around the same time, and wanted to support councils with guidance and tools alongside the revenue that this would bring for behaviour change programmes. So I've got a link here, and I can share that in the chat afterwards, or I'll share that with Dan, and he hopefully can share that with you, to this report that gives practical advice about how workplaces and local authorities can identify cycling to work as an option, as a possibility, small things that we can change about the way we travel, that just guidance that's really practical, but also messaging for different audience as well. So that messaging for your colleagues, messaging for the leadership team within the organisation, messaging from the local authority. So really practical advice as to how we can create that moment of change and encourage and support people to choose a different method of transport, and hopefully a lower carbon method of transport. School streets. So school streets is another of our initiatives where we work with local authorities, we work with local schools and local residents to look at the way people travel to school. So school streets vary from place to place. They can be implemented in lots of different ways. And in most cases, it's where traffic is restricted in some form. So it could be like the picture shows here, with a physical barrier. It could be with signage. It could be with cameras. The camera element is still being looked at as to where it can be utilised. I know it can be in London, but not so much elsewhere in the country at the moment. But that's being worked on. And it just restricts that traffic at the start and the end of the school day, because we know that school traffic creates quite a lot of that traffic movement in the mornings and in the afternoons. We've worked with Playing Out to create a video on how to steward a school street. So really practical advice about how you can implement this in local schools, and different ways that you can do that. And there's a link to that sort of element on our website, lots of different tools there. And there's also a report written by We Are Possible, and they found that school streets can effectively reduce air pollution and road danger outside school gates. That primary schools are 4 times more likely than secondary schools to have a school street. But again, that creates that behaviour change from a younger age. There's children, you know, we sometimes create competitive environments, like cycle to Bike to School Week, which we'll talk about in a second, Big Pedal, where the children, it's a playful competition between the children that encourages them to encourage their parents to actively travel to school. And by starting in primary school, hopefully you take that journey with you to secondary school. There are approximately 430 schemes across the 4 cities that they are looking at, so London, Birmingham, Leeds and Bristol, with more plans. And this is something that is transferable to all areas of the UK. And there is a link to that report, which again, I can share. There's a report that We Are Possible have done, looking at the real positive impacts that this can have. Lastly, I'll mention Bike to School Week. So that's happening in a couple of weeks, 27th of September onwards. And it's, again, a week-long event across the UK to encourage families to cycle and scoot to school. It's a great way to celebrate the huge benefits that an active school run brings. It takes place, again, sort of end of September, and we've got hundreds of resources on our website for teachers, as well as local authorities, on how to bring it to life, how lesson plans and assemblies and workshops and things that can help really sort of show people and show the pupils, but then also the pupils can take home to their parents as to the real benefits of how being active can help concentration, can help mental health, can help attendance, and hopefully take that back into their personal lives as well. So hopefully there's a sort of 3 really practical ways that that we work, Sustrans work, to create that decarbonising transport element, and to look at that carbon and climate change that we can do practically. And as I said, there's many other things that I could share with you, but I'll leave it there for now so that we've got some time for some questions. And just remember to end sharing.
Thank you so much for that, really. That was absolutely fascinating. Really excellent work it sounds like you're doing, and delighted that you've joined us today, and delighted to be partnering with you. We've got time, I think, for a few questions before we head into the comfort break. So Dan, I'm going to ask you to read out a selection of the questions and comments that have come through during the presentation.
Thank you, Councillor, and thank you, Riddy. That was really great. And actually, there's a lot of comments that echo that sentiment, that people have really appreciated that presentation. So thank you from us all. A very specific question from Tony G again. Do you have figures for the use of cycles purely for pleasure and exercise, as opposed to cycling to get to and from a place of work? I think it's a really good question, actually, because cycling is a pleasurable exercise as well as a mode of travel.
Absolutely. I don't have them to hand, but I can definitely find those. I think data is really important here, and we've probably something that we can talk about shortly here, that knowing who is cycling and walking and who is taking what sort of journeys really helps you to focus where you focus that energy on the infrastructure that you create, the behaviour change techniques that you create, the types of activities that you put on. And yes, I do believe that there is some data available for the breakdown of what types of journeys people make, and I will make sure to get that to you.
Wonderful, thank you. I wanted to just touch back on the question in the previous presentation by Mr. Senscall, who was talking of the current mood of apathy and consumerism, actually, and how in the near future can we work towards winning hearts and minds. And I guess specifically, I'm really keen to hear how we could work as a collective. So all the participants on this group, the council, Sustrans, working together. Have you any thoughts on actually how we might take that forward?
Absolutely. It's, for me, I think that the key message and the key sort of journey that we can take people on is that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I think people do often think that sustainable transport and that people like Sustrans always consider all or nothing. But I think that we're not doing enough on messaging on every little helps type thing. So one journey a week does make a difference, because if each of us made one journey a week, that would make a difference. But it's looking at things like initiatives, like I mentioned, sort of the moment of change work. It looks at how we can work with businesses, we could work with organisations, we could work with the council, with the local authority, with schools, to create that culture of change. And it doesn't just come with one element. It doesn't just come with providing bike parking. It comes with encouraging people. It comes with bike buddying schemes where someone takes someone new on a journey, or with journey planning and supporting people. There's lots of different elements, and we need to work together in order to find the ways that we can all bring our own expertise in to creating all that the whole environment that's needed to help people to create that change, or change their journeys. And it's, yeah, that I think for me the key thing is it's not all or nothing, and that we should be working on that we should be encouraging and supporting people to make small changes so that they can see the difference that it might make. I hope that answered the question. I feel like I rambled a little bit around the houses, but yeah.
I think we all would agree that was a very full answer, and an excellent one at that. So just the final point, and there's a few questions that have picked up on the town centre. Some of them have referenced specific retailers or establishments, but perhaps a question which Mr. Minnell has asked via the email gives us an opportunity to answer all of that. And the question is, how can Rugby Town Centre maximise the opportunities of pedestrianisation and bus transport to ensure cleaner air around the town centre? So initially, I'll put that question to you, Councillor Lowe, but following that, really, if you have any observations about our town centre and our plans for the town centre and how we might progress those to support cleaner transport, that would be really useful. So first of all, Seb.
Thanks, Dan. And look, once again, thanks to Mr. Minnell for an excellent question. So look, everyone's aware, I think, that the council is currently undertaking significant work developing a new long-term strategy for the town centre. And by its very nature, this strategy will be highly ambitious and will focus on the long-term spatial changes needed to make our town centre one that we can be proud of, and one which drives economic recovery, and one that's fit for future generations. In March of this year, when we first asked residents about their priorities for the town centre, many responded that walking, cycling and bus travel were important to them. And we've listened to this, and we've ensured that sustainable transport is a continued theme through our emerging thoughts. The council will be consulting on this work in the very near future, and I strongly urge everybody here today to get involved in that consultation and share your views on the emerging plans, and in particular to show how we'd approach the aspiration of supporting sustainable travel. Alongside the town centre strategy, there is other work which helps address the same problems. For example, we're currently developing the Parks Connector network, which I mentioned earlier, which promotes and encourages safe cycling and walking between our green spaces. We're also in early stage discussion with sub-regional partners around extending very light railway services into the town. And we continue to engage with the Highways Authority as they develop their forthcoming local transport plan, of which environment, including air quality, is a key theme. And finally, we continue to liaise with transport providers to better understand and overcome the challenges of public transport throughout the borough. This is obviously a key time for us here in Rugby as we develop our spatial strategy, and the spatial strategy is, as I said, ambitious. It's no exaggeration to say we're only going to get a chance to do something like this once every century, probably, if not more. So it's important that we get it right, and it's important that we have as broad a range of views from our residents as possible. So I strongly urge, if anyone's got any further thoughts to share on this issue, please either respond to the consultation or send into the email address climatesummit@rugby.gov.uk, and I will ensure that they're given due consideration. So that's what I have to say on that, which I hope has broadly answered Mr. Minnell's question. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, really.
Yeah, just a couple of things, and I'll be quick because I know we're eating into our break. But the boldness is key. Just being bold and understanding that change takes time to settle. And everyone here is likely to have been to a fully pedestrianised town centre, and it at the time you would have felt safe, you would have felt comfortable, you would have felt happy to be there. And there's an economic benefit. The economic benefits show that people on foot and on bike spend perhaps less on each visit, but they visit more often because they feel safe and happy to be there. So the economic benefits are there for that pedestrianisation. And then lastly, one thing that I will sort of say whilst you're writing your sort of plan and strategy is that it needs to be easy. The connectivity, the wayfinding, the signage, it all needs to be completely seamless in order to make people feel comfortable, safe and welcome to use that active travel environment and to be on foot. And yeah, so those are the sort of three things that I wanted to pick up on there, but I think your points were yeah, key. And so thank you for having me today.
It's been a real pleasure, really. That was a really excellent presentation, actually, and particularly I think we're all very grateful that you managed to juggle it alongside childcare as well. We're all in that boat. You might have heard my kids a minute ago. So yeah, we're all in that boat these days.
Thank you.
Well, look, we're now due to break for a short comfort break. We are due to come back online at 11:40. The connectivity will remain live throughout, microphones will remain on, but I would urge you all now to use the opportunity to go and grab a cup of tea or whatever. We will reconvene in 14 minutes, so thank you. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone's feeling suitably refreshed and ready for our final two presentations before we look to agree some next steps. So the third theme for today is voluntary and community sector involvement, and I look forward in a few moments to hearing from Alex Becker from Transition Town Rugby. Earlier today, I suggested that achieving the levels of change which are required to address the climate emergency would not be possible without genuinely engaging and involving at a local level, and that by encouraging local discussion and collaboration, we could be collectively identifying the issues and co-delivering sustainable solutions. We know that the voluntary and community sector is particularly strong within our borough, and that the groups and individuals involved bring a wealth of knowledge, expertise and passion. The pandemic has not dampened the borough's volunteering spirit, far from it, with existing groups continuing their valuable work together with new groups emerging to tackle key issues such as supporting the vulnerable, supporting medical services and keeping their local areas looking their best. Within the council's own parks and open spaces service, we know that we've benefited from over 9,200 hours of volunteering activity over the past 12 months. It would be remiss of me not to recognise those efforts now, and so I'd like to express my genuine and heartfelt thanks to all of these individuals and voluntary groups for their ongoing and tireless efforts. Notwithstanding these inspiring achievements, when our climate survey asked residents about becoming more involved in climate related initiatives locally, 53% of respondents felt they could do more. The most common barriers to doing this included a lack of awareness of local opportunities and that information provided was too generic and not local enough. So how do we address this? How do we begin to work across the voluntary, private and public sectors to develop that shared narrative and shared commitment to solutions? As previously, if you have any thoughts or comments regarding these questions, I would encourage you to submit them either via the Q&A chat or via the email address provided earlier. One group that I know has continued to work through the pandemic is Transition Town Rugby. In addition to their regular resident engagement and sustainable Saturday events, we're very grateful to receive a most informative presentation from the group to our own climate working group. And so it is with great pleasure that I now hand over to Alex Becker. So Alex, it's over to you if you're with us.
Oh, just waiting for it to unmute. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, Alex. We can hear you.
Good. Okay, then thank you. So there was a slight delay there while my computer was thinking about it. Okay, then. So I'm just going to start sharing my presentation. So. Okay, then. So I'm hoping that's now coming up. Okay, then. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting our group along. It's been really interesting so far to hear what the other speakers have been saying. I've been particularly interested to hear, talking about things like hearts and minds, and how do we get to kind of helping people to change the way they think and the way they behave about things, because that's something that obviously we're very kind of interested in as well. And helping to make people make those positive choices. And I also really like some of the things that Rishi was saying about things like school streets as well. And that, again, that's something, that's one of the kind of things that groups like Transition Towns really interested in doing. So just a little bit about our group, about myself first. I work for, I don't work for, I'm a volunteer for, we're all volunteers. And that's what this presentation is all about. It's about the people who are there on the ground doing things, but it's not part of our job. It's not something that we get paid to do. It's just something that we're doing because we genuinely care about the town and about our communities and about our futures. So my name's Alex. I'm just I'm an engineer by trade. I was also a teacher, and these days I spend quite a lot of my time now trying to kind of help out around issues to do with the environment and climate change in and around the town. So we were given this remit of presenting the view from the voluntary and the community sector. On reflection, this was quite a large task, or representing potentially a large number of people in rugby with many diverse views. So I just decided I'd take the opportunity to kind of state exactly what it is that I want to talk about, and maybe something that I'm going to try and avoid. I just want to be really clear, as volunteers, as just ordinary people, we're not experts. Okay, then. So, you know, we can't answer maybe some of the more detailed questions. We don't have all the facts and figures. What we do have is a lot of opinions on the kind of thing that should be done. And if you talk to our various different members and other groups in rugby, you know, there are hundreds of ideas and suggestions of things that could be done in rugby. However, if I was to share all of those ideas with you today, we could be here for hours. So I'm going to try not to deluge you with all of those ideas. And importantly, you know, I'm not going to claim to represent the voice of all the community groups in rugby. So what does that actually mean? I'm going to keep it specific to the climate and environmental, the groups who focus on climate and environmental action. I think that's quite pertinent to today. So the things that I want to talk to you about in brief is, you know, first of all, I'm sure everyone's interested to know what groups are out there in rugby and what kind of things are going on. And I'd like to just share with you a little bit of our experiences of what it's like trying to sort of work in this environment. And as part of that, I'll also be sharing, and I've sort of tried to ask around and find out what people are thinking about what the council have done up to now. Okay, then, and you know, fair warning, the message isn't particularly great at the moment. Okay, then, but then I'll also I'll be suggesting some of the things that we believe needs to happen. Okay, then. Some pictures slowly appearing there. So a question that I get asked often is, what is a transition town? A transition town, well, I mean, take the word transition, you know, it's to do with this idea of changing, okay? And we, as a starting point, recognise that the world is changing, unfortunately, due to things like climate change and other things that are going on. Our lives are changing, and it's all about coming together. And it starts with communities. Okay, it's a grassroots thing. It's people saying, well, okay, maybe we don't want to wait for the governments to tell us what to do. We're just going to start taking action by ourselves. And it's saying, okay, well, you know, things might be about to change, and maybe they're changing for the worse, but how can we make the place where we live more resilient to those kind of changes? Okay. Transition towns themselves have been going for something like 15 years. It didn't start in rugby. Here in rugby, our group has been going only for about 2 years. So, you know, we've made a good start, but we still think there's lots more that we can do in rugby, and I think most people would agree with that. Other things that we try and do, you know, it's also about local economy. We're trying to find ways to, you know, support local people rather than, you know, kind of trying to avoid buying things from like the large shops and Amazon and things like that. You know, how can we keep the money that's in our town within the local economy? Fighting climate change is obviously a really big part of what we do. And another way that transition towns work is we provide a network. So we want to try and link people up, and we know that there are lots of people around rugby who are concerned, and some of the statistics and, you know, the results of the survey that we've heard today really highlight the fact that so many people out there really are very concerned about particularly the issue of climate change. And one of the things we can do is to start bringing people together. And if we just have a look at some of the pictures there, you know, these are some of the things that other transition town groups in the country have done. So these aren't specifically rugby things, but you know, community gardens is a really big one. You know, bringing people together, going back to, you know, like local food, organic food, all these things which are good for the environment. There's some stuff down the bottom there about some of the things which groups have achieved. There's a picture there of a seed library, repair cafe, and on the bottom right there, we've got you know, a community renewables group. You know, and these are all things which is perfectly possible to happen in Rugby as well. And one way that the transition towns work is we can support people. You know, we're not necessarily going to say, you know, we're starting all these groups and here's what you can do to help. It kind of goes the other way. It's like, if you want to come to us and say, I want to start a community solar group, we will say, yeah, we can help you, and we'll put you in touch with the right people in Rugby, and we can help you get funding and that kind of thing. So as we say, we kind of act as an umbrella organisation in that sense. And just down the bottom there, you can see our website as well, and you can find out a bit more about that on our website. Obviously, we're not the only group in Rugby which is doing things. There are other groups doing work specifically on climate change. We've got Friends of the Earth who are active in Rugby. Increasingly, there's eco churches as well are doing lots of really good work, and there's now a Green Christians group who I know are trying to do things now, and also there are individuals as well, lots of individuals doing their own thing, but it's not particularly joined up in Rugby. You know, there's lots of little groups doing their own little things. So that brings me on to what sort of things are happening in Rugby. And again, it's fair to say, you know, from the volunteering and community's perspective, the groups are small and the projects that we're undertaking are also small, although some of them are really exciting. I mean, the bottom three on the left hand side there, sorry, the three on the left hand side are all examples of community gardens which have been set up in Rugby. So we've got one there in Eastlands, close to where I live. The one on the bottom left there is that's actually right in the town centre. That's the Pleasance Herb Garden, beg your pardon, which is, for those of you that know the town centre, it's just opposite the Squirrel Pub. It's a nice little space. We've actually just received some grant money to really start to improve that, and we're going to put some raised beds in there and hopefully make that a really nice area. The one in the middle there is down in Dunchurch. And then the photos on the right, we've got some other things going as well. And actually, the one on the top right-hand corner there is our famous Rugby Repair Cafe, and that's actually happening right now in St Andrew's Church. Only about 10 minutes left of it, but that's a really and people really, you know, really enjoy coming along to the Repair Cafe, because that's something that I think a lot of people can really relate to. And then the bottom right there, that is our part of our Sustainable Saturdays, which is something which has just started up again. And Sustainable Saturdays is event again in St Andrew's Church in town, but you know, we're also hoping to spread it out to different parts of Rugby. And it is, you know, it can be anything to do with sustainable living, but we just invite people to come along. So we've got local businesses. That's our own little climate emergency centre there. You know, and other groups who've got something that they want to contribute, you know, can just come along and set up a stall. So it's a really exciting and interesting event. But having said all that, you know, again, I come back to the fact that all these things that are happening are small in scale. Okay, then. And what I say there is we are limited, and the thing that's limiting us is the capacity. It's our numbers. Okay, there are, given that Rugby is quite a large place, very few really people who are actually actively involved in doing this kind of thing. And obviously that's something that we'd like to change. We'd like to get more people involved, because we've got big ambitions. We think there are loads of things that we could potentially do, looking at other things that other transition towns have done. But at the moment we're limited. Transition Town Rugby, as an example, our steering group only contains 3 people. And in terms of our members who are actually kind of come and actively help us, we probably get about half a dozen, you know, and that's not enough for us to do all the things that we would really like to do. So I want to present what we feel the general view is from Rugby, okay, then, on behalf of the community and voluntary groups. And this is kind of a summary of where I think we're at the moment. I've just talked about the kind of things that our community groups do, and we feel like we could be potentially doing more, but again, we're limited by the number of people who actually, come and help us. And I think there was, it's interesting to hear that a lot of people, I think it was about 50% of people in Rugby just don't know, where the opportunities are. And, hopefully that's something that we can start to improve. But it's not something that we really know how to do at the moment. So again, maybe that's something that the council could be helping out with. And we can be more joined up. And again, there are certain barriers to actually taking action, which again, we can start looking at ways to remove them. I mean, obviously a big one is funding. The more money that is available to groups like ours, the more things we can start thinking about doing. So it's about the people, it's about communicating between groups, and it's about giving us access to some of the things that we need. And we have problems kind of finding the right people to talk to when we want to start projects. Kind of just general sort of legislation and things like that. So it's difficult when you're just part-time, it's not your job, you're just a volunteer and you're trying to sort all these things out. You can understand that it's actually quite challenging. One of the real problems that I think a lot of people, we ask ourselves, why don't more people get involved? And I really think a lot of people simply don't know where to start. Okay, and I think I'm not even sure that's something that we can do a lot about, because the issue of climate change is so big and so kind of, it's sort of overwhelming to a lot of people, I think. And again, I think that's something where if the council were to start taking more of a lead on this, and today is hopefully a really good start, I think this is something, that can now start to happen. So the message that I want to give is that we want to be part of the solution. We want to help. We're struggling at the moment. And one of the things that I think is really going to help is if the council can start to provide more leadership. Okay, and that means influencing people's lives. And, again, we go back to what was talked about before, hearts and minds. Okay, and that's got to come from the top. We can spread the message through our groups, but it's also got to come from the top. Okay, you need to set the right example and kind of show people where to start. And I've just put a couple of silly emojis down the bottom there because having talked to people who work within our groups and down at Sustainable Saturdays, and I talk to people about this kind of thing a lot. And whenever we talk about what's been happening with the council so far, this is the reaction that I get, unfortunately: disappointment, anger, and worst of all, I know it seems people are kind of asking questions to the council. Some people who really care are sending questions in, sending their suggestions in, helpful suggestions, and almost being met with complete silence. You can understand how disappointing this is for people in Rugby. And we just got to take a quick look. And I'm having a bit of a complaint here, okay then, but there will be a bit of a good news message at the end. But if we just look at what's been sort of on the council's website, a lot of this at the moment doesn't particularly ring true when you read through it. Okay, then they're nice words, but we don't see a lot of action happening. And there's a few things that have happened in town recently which we found really quite disappointing. I mean, there's over the last few years, there's been a lot of expansion in the housing around Rugby. Ancient hedgerows being cut down, trees being cut down. The new housing that's being put in place doesn't seem to take any account for environment and climate change issues. Like, why can't we have solar panels on the new houses? Why can't the new housing developments have excellent cycling infrastructure? These are all things that could have been put in place but haven't. We also hear that some new diesel bin lorries have been purchased. Why haven't we bought electric bin lorries? And a lot of people have been pretty annoyed about the drive-through McDonald's that's just come into the centre of town. It's why, when we're trying to reduce the amount of traffic, why are we bringing a drive-through into the town centre? Okay, so on the one hand, we see statements like we have on the left, but the action at the moment doesn't seem to be backing it up. Okay, then. That's my little moan, and it's not just coming from me. This is almost toned down compared to some of the things that people have been saying to me. Okay. I don't want to leave it on that note. I want to bring the good news, and I want to bring our suggestions as to what we think we can do and ways which we can work together. I'm really encouraged to hear the council saying, you know, that you want to work with the community and you want to work with businesses, because I think that's really what needs to happen. As you've said, you've hit the nail on the head. Actually, the majority of people recognise that things really have to change. They should have changed already. But you know, there's no time like the present to start doing this. What we're asking for is a clear vision, because people need to understand exactly what's going on. We need a clear vision, and this has got to come from the council. And you then have to commit. We need to see the commitment behind it. We need targets, and we need to see that the targets are being worked towards. And it's my belief that the council on your own won't be able to achieve this. You need the backing of all the people in Rugby, you need the community groups, you need the businesses. We all need to work together. So here are suggestions, and this has come from sort of asking around and trying to gauge opinions. As we've already said, working in isolation I don't think will achieve anything particularly significant. Council, businesses and communities all need to get together. So this leads me to one of our first suggestions. We would like to see a new position created on the council for a officer with the single responsibility of climate and environment. The climate emergency working group thus far hasn't been particularly effective. In our opinion, we haven't really seen a great deal of action coming from there, and in our opinion, this comes from it's a question of accountability and it's a question of responsibility. We would like to see a person with a single responsibility, and also you know, we're talking about ways to communicate. We suggest a citizens panel or equivalents, and that would be a group that would meet with the climate or environment officer, and a group that has representation from all the different parts of Rugby and also the different demographics within Rugby as well. You know, we'd like to see people from schools represented. We'd like to see people, you know, retired people represented, working people represented, people of different faiths. You know, everyone who's got an interest in the town needs to be a part of this. And the climate environment officer needs to be answerable to, you know, to be answering the questions and to give us the information. And, you know, we can feed that back to the communities, and that way there should be, you know, we can enable more communication and, you know, more sharing of information. I think there's already been mentioned, you know, that some studies are going to be undertaken, and I believe that's absolutely what needs to happen. We need to understand what's going to happen in Rugby, what the potential effects of climate change will be, and to do that we need experts. You know, we need to commission reports as to what's going on and really understand it, and then share that information. Let us know what's going on as well. It sounds like, again, a climate action plan is part of your plan. That's great. It needs to come with measurable targets. Okay, and again, you know, we need to see someone taking responsibility for that plan. Again, that comes back to our suggestion of an officer or a single person on the council who holds responsibility for that. We'd also suggest, you know, I think this has been talked about as well, you know, we need some kind of incentives for people to actually start making these changes. Some people are already making the changes, but really it needs to involve more people. So, you know, and businesses as well are the ways that the council can use their powers to, you know, give people that little extra nudge to actually start making the changes that need to happen. And another interesting one, and again, one that it sounds like people are thinking about already, and there was that great comment about having this facsimile house in the town somewhere, which I think is a wonderful idea. But what we're suggesting is, you know, at the very least, can we create some kind of public space in town where people can visit and find out more information, ask questions, learn, okay, signposting ways to help and things that they can do. And there are lots of places in the town centre where this could potentially take place. The library and art gallery would be a good one. There's so many empty shop fronts in town. You know, what would it take to just take one of those over and just use that? And this has happened in several other places around the country. And I think this would be a really important way of just getting that message out to people and helping people to understand what they can do. So that's pretty much it from me. So, you know, I want to thank you again for giving us this opportunity. Just to summarise, again, our final message is, you know, we don't want to just see popular things happening anymore. We actually need to see real action. We need to see something effective happening. It's got to make a difference. This is happening now. We will all get behind you if you're willing to make these changes. And then a message for people who may be watching this presentation and thinking maybe they can get involved. I would encourage you to just take the leap and come along. You can visit us on our website there, and I've just put a list down the bottom of some of our upcoming events. So we've got a steering group meeting, which is monthly at the end of the month. And then we've got some of our regular events happening. There's our next Sustainable Saturday Market at St Andrew's Church on the 2nd of October. Our working group, which is again monthly, down at the Herb Garden. That's the one opposite the Squirrel in town. And we also do a social thing, and that happens in the middle of the month on a Wednesday. And you can find all these events on our website and on Facebook as well. So that brings me to the end. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Alex, for that presentation. I just want to comment a little bit, if I may. I do think there is perhaps a little bit of a disconnect that I'm sure can't have been. I'm sure I'm not the only person this hasn't been lost on, that between your assertion that the council needs to provide more leadership on this issue when you're making that assertion at a summit that we've organised for that very specific purpose. And I also think maybe there is a bit of a disconnect between your suggestion that we involve the voluntary sector when you and many others are here at our invitation for that very purpose. But I will just address some of the other points that you made as well. You did reference the council's corporate strategy, and in particular the outcome around climate. As you're probably aware, the council consulted with residents in December of last year to understand the issues that they thought we ought to address in the corporate strategy. And it was that feedback received through the consultation that was used in the formulation of the commitments that we have within the strategy, in particular those relating to climate change. The strategy has been agreed by full council in February of this year, and immediately after this we went about commissioning an external report from an external expert to really help us put the meat on the bones of what we needed to do to reach our net zero commitments and to progress our work in relation to the climate emergency. We will see the results of this work within the next few weeks. So in terms of engaging with suitable external experts, I do agree with you, but I would suggest that we are considerably further along that process than perhaps might seem apparent, or certainly became apparent from your presentation. In terms of the strategy itself, I mean, you know, it is intentionally a very high level document that doesn't go into the level of detail that maybe you were hoping for here, but I can understand how that could lead you to thinking that maybe it's too vague and there's no way of measuring progress. But let me be very clear, the corporate strategy sets the broad strategic priorities, but our detailed plans in relation to the climate emergency and the measures of success that we attach to our actions will be clarified through the forthcoming climate strategy, which I referenced earlier on today. Through events such as this one and our current resident survey, I am confident that we can capture the specific aspirations and measures which our communities are looking for. You also raised the point about whether the council should have a dedicated climate officer, and to be honest, my view on this has always been that whilst this would undoubtedly provide some short-term assurance and perhaps look good cosmetically, ultimately my view is that by instilling this, we need to instill this as a corporate responsibility and have ownership of that agenda across the council. So it shouldn't just be the responsibility of one individual, it's everybody's responsibility starting right from the top. I don't want to silo that within the responsibility of one individual. And finally, just picking up on your suggestion of a citizens panel, I think that's an excellent one, and I'd be really keen to work with you to determine what that should look like. So yeah, very happy to pick that up. Dan, over to you now, I think, for some of the questions from the floor.
Thank you, Councillor Lowe. And if I may just pick up on the point about electric waste lorries, Alex is right. We did procure some new waste vehicles during the pandemic, and within that procurement, we asked for all available environmentally friendly solutions to be submitted as part of the process. Unfortunately, none that were suitable came back to us, and our research suggested that the market wasn't quite there yet in terms of procuring electric bin lorries. We are looking at fleet electrification in general, and certainly some of our smaller vehicles we think are suitable for switching to electric. There are challenges with that. As you may be aware, we have an in-house team of mechanics and a workshop, all of which needs to be retrained and refitted with things like rubber floors and new machinery to enable us to do it. So it's a really valid point about the use of electric vehicles. There are some challenges, but it's something we're very much on with. In terms of questions, I'd just like to call on a question which came in through the email address. And again, it's a question from Mr. Minnell of the several that he submitted.
I feel we should have had Mr. Minnell as a panelist.
I think in the future we should. Mr. Minnell asks, Councillor, how do you think that the local and global Rotarian movement can support action to address climate change?
Oh, well, thanks once again, Mr. Minnell. Obviously, I'm very much aware of the long and illustrious history of the Rugby Rotarians and the work which Rotary and the Council have done together over the years. I've been delighted to witness and hear about some of the Rotary Club's sterling work in the Borough, be that through the Music Festival or your conservation projects on the Great Central Way or the Creative Lockdown Youth Challenge. Moving into the Rotary Club's centenary year here in Rugby, I think it would be entirely appropriate and indeed welcomed if we were able to enhance our joint working, in particular to focus on this very important subject matter. I look forward to progressing this discussion with you and your fellow Rotarians, and equally, I'm very keen to extend that same invitation to other third sector partners, recognising that to be successful in addressing the climate emergency, we must all work together. I do think that how we do this merits some further thought and further discussion in the near future, and I'd also be really keen, Alex, to hear your views on how like-minded third sector organisations can join up to deliver climate change initiatives collaboratively. So, Alex, I don't know if you want to comment on that. If you can find your mute button.
See, it seems to take a long time to unmute itself for some reason. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Alex.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, then, yeah. For some reason, my mute button's kind of flashing on and off, which is a slightly weird thing to do. Okay, I mean, I just want to quickly address the point that you made about the slight disconnect as well, if I may, Councillor. I think if there is a slight disconnect, I think I'd like to say that that's just that's representative, I think, of the feeling, and I just wanted to communicate that feeling, you know, from the people that are doing this kind of work in Rugby. Okay, then, however, you know, I do want to reiterate as well that we will support and events like this we absolutely welcome, and we hope that this is the start of you know, kind of a more communicative relationship with the council, which we really welcome. And sorry, so the question, just remind me of the question again. Sorry.
It was just around how like-minded third sector organisations can join up to deliver climate change initiatives more collaboratively. So how can we work together more collaboratively, in other words, Alex? Yeah,
I mean, so one of the challenges that we have is just kind of getting the information out there. You know, we are doing things, but you know, our reach, if you like, doesn't seem to be particularly effective. And you know, there needs to be some kind of channel by which I think we can share some of the work that we're doing. And you know, if we can if we can kind of join up with other, you know, similarly minded groups, but have some way of reaching more effectively. And that, you know, that again comes down to our suggestion of, you know, maybe some kind of public space in Rugby where this could be made more widely available. But, you know, again, because we're so small in nature, we just don't have a particularly loud voice. So we do need some help, I suppose, amplifying that voice. And you know, if we can be, if there's a way of bringing several of these different groups and our voices together, I think that might be something to look at.
Well, I'm very happy to help you amplify that voice, Alex, and indeed, whilst doing it, look forward to you claiming that we're failing to help you amplify your voice.
Well, you know, I think the way to look at it is we are always going to be here to challenge you, and I hope that you welcome that challenge.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Marvellous. Dan, how many more questions do we have? Do we have time for any more?
Hi Seb, I think we're actually possibly slightly overrun, so I'll suggest that we move on at that point, but take Alex's point there, and I will pick up the discussion about conduit to the council and similarly the support which Warwickshire Carver might be able to provide to Alex's group and other such groups.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, thank you very much for coming along today, Alex. Really engaging presentation, and always welcome a bit of debate and challenge. So thank you very much for attending today. We move now to our fourth and final theme, which is conservation and biodiversity. So in a few moments, I'm going to hand over to Ian Jelly from the Warwickshire Wildlife Trust for what I'm sure will be a very thought-provoking presentation. The damaging effects which human activity and climate change can have on the natural environment have been laid out in the starkest possible forms for many years now, and yet it continues. According to a recent survey, the number of trees worldwide has decreased by 46% since the start of civilization. We know that in addition to the loss of habitat, deforestation reduces the ability of forests to provide the critical benefit of absorbing carbon, which helps mitigate the effects of climate change, and yet it continues. And more broadly, we know that habitat loss and the elimination or alteration of the conditions necessary for animals and plants to survive not only impacts individual species, but impacts the health of the global ecosystem, and yet it continues. We've seen that people care about the natural environment and habitats and are willing to take action. Who can forget the Blue Planet effect and the momentum that David Attenborough's TV series brought to the agenda to reduce plastic pollutions in the oceans? We saw national newspapers launching their own campaigns, with organisations pledging to eliminate single-use plastics and with individuals taking actions to change their own behaviours. We need to harness this desire to change and ensure that we will, in this borough, play our part. Globally, political leaders representing 88 countries from all regions have committed to reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. Research shows that to be successful, this will need investment of an additional $600 to $800 billion each year. This is a huge undertaking, but one to which, to my mind, we simply don't have a choice. We must turn the words and desires into action and use them to build momentum. We cannot afford dither and delay, because biodiversity loss is happening today, and it's happening at a frightening rate. Locally in Rugby, we're privileged to have wonderfully diverse habitats with numerous designated sites of special scientific interest, local nature reserves and nature conservation sites. Linking into the previous theme, I recognise and thank the efforts of many of our volunteers who work tirelessly to look after these sites. We, the council, are determined to protect our natural environment and will take the measures to do so where we're able to. We have recently adopted a new tree policy and pollinator friendly policy, recognising the vital role that both trees and pollinators play in sustaining our natural environment. Similarly, we will continue to protect our open spaces through fields in trust deeds of dedication, ensuring that open spaces remain protected and accessible for generations to come. And so, to share the views of Warwickshire Wildlife Trust on this important issue, it gives me huge pleasure to welcome and introduce Ian Jelly. So Ian, are you with us this morning?
Hello, yes, thank you very much for that fantastic introduction. That was set the scene really nicely for hopefully what you will all find to be an informative talk. So let me just load up my slides. Okay, I'm going to talk to you for about 20 minutes or so about how nature can help us tackle the climate crisis and the role that everybody can play in supporting nature's recovery. The story starts for us actually 50 years ago, or just over 50 years ago now, back in 1970. And that was when Warwickshire Wildlife Trust, the charity, was established. We came out of a group of passionate local volunteers that were working across the West Midlands and established Warwickshire Wildlife Trust, which was has ever since been working across Warwickshire, Coventry and Solihull. And over the next few decades, the charity's achieved an awful lot for nature conservation, thanks largely to the hard work and dedication of volunteers, but also the fantastic support of our members. During that time, we've established 65 nature reserves that now cover over 1,000 hectares for wildlife, engaged hundreds of thousands of school children and adults alike in the importance of nature conservation, established a nationwide environmental consultancy that provides specialist advice to developers and others on how to support and protect protected species, and safeguarded some of our rarest species, reintroducing species that have become lost, vaccinated badgers, and played a critical role working in partnerships with the like of Rugby Borough Council and local community groups to help safeguard our green spaces for the future. So an awful lot has been achieved, and we should never overlook that, because in the face of the ecological crisis that we're facing, it can often be easy to forget what has been achieved over those last 5 decades. But despite that, unfortunately, every graph that you look at, as the councillor alluded to in the introduction, goes down like this. I'm no maths expert, but I know when a graph goes down like that, it tends to not be a very good thing. And whatever species you choose, if you look at the graph, it tends to go in the same way. So we are failing in our efforts to preserve and enhance nature conservation. Despite all of the hard work that we have done locally, we are overseeing in Warwickshire the same thing that's happening in the UK and across the world. The UK is now at risk of losing 15% of its species in our lifetime. And if you just take a moment to pause and think about that and the history of our country, 15% of all species potentially going to be extinct within our lifetime. What a horrendous legacy to pass on to future generations. People will look back and wonder why we didn't do more. It is very complex as to why the wildlife is in decline. There's a huge range of different factors driving nature to the brink. And the newest kid on the block is climate change. And obviously we're meeting here to talk about climate change. That could be a significant factor in the future. The UK is now regarded as one of the most nature depleted countries on Earth, which again is a really depressing stat. Of 218 countries assessed, the UK came 189th, which is really not where we should be, bearing in mind how developed we are, how much technology, how much our economic power is. And yet the UK is slowly but surely eroding the value of its natural world. And when you take into consideration the climate change effect, that has a huge potential implication on the remaining wildlife and the wildlife that's hanging on by its fingertips. It's been well documented in the news, as the councillor said in the introduction, that we are facing a really threatening global picture with the climate emergency that we're facing. And the issue there, which has been covered already today, is that we get to these tipping points, that if you get to a certain level, it's irreversible. And I don't think that could be stressed too much. This isn't something that we can just roll back the clock when the technology catches up in 50 or 100 years time. If the climate change gets to a point where it is irreversible, then there's no way back. And the problem with that, when you take it into account and the impact of that on the biodiversity or the wildlife, is that you start to put species that are already under pressure over the brink, and they then reach a tipping point where they can't come back. And climate change poses a real range of different challenges for our native wildlife. It challenges the habitats. Habitats rely on certain conditions, certain weather. You get wetlands where it rains a lot, or where the water naturally sits within the soil structure. And the likelihood of extreme weather events, either really hot spells or really dry spells, can push these habitats and change the dynamics of the sort of landscape that we have in this country. It can pose threats from things like invasive species that come over from other countries that are able to settle here because of the changing climatic conditions. I think that at this point it's really important to just pause and take a consideration again of where the commitments are against where we actually need to be on climate to cause genuine action. So this diagram here is a bit complicated and there's lots of numbers on it, but as you can see, there's a kind of a thermometer style approach. And currently we are at 1.2 degrees warming in 2020 when this measurement was taken on pre-industrial levels. And if you look at the first blue area, you've got pledges and targets. And what that shows is if the current global pledges are delivered, then we look to see a 1.9 degree rise. And if in the worst case scenario, that could be as much as 3 degrees. But actually, they are only pledges and targets, and they're not actually being implemented at the moment. So globally, the current policies could lead to a 2.1 degree rise in global temperatures, or in worst case scenario, nearly 4 degrees. And even if we move to a stage where we're considering the optimistic targets, but they're not being implemented yet, that's still presenting an average of a potential 2 degree rise. And that may not sound a lot, but if you consider the impact of 2 degrees, what we have done is we've commissioned studies locally about what that will happen, what the impacts will be for species in our local area. And what you find is the 2 degree warming across all of the range of habitats that we have starts to push a number of species to the brink. And the shocking thing about this slide is the range of impact on the species that are at the base of the food chain. Not many people know about millipedes or centipedes or a lot of the insects that we have, and a lot of them have got Latin names and are not necessarily as charismatic as others. But these are the basis of life on Earth. If you start to lose these, you start to lose species further up the food chain. And at the very top of the food chain are humans. The other impact is the extreme weather events can lead to extreme responses and impacts on nature. So, you might get increased flooding, you might get increased wildfires. The number of days with high wildfire risk will double if we move to a 2 degree warming across the globe. And then they quadruple if we move to a 4 degree warming across the globe. If you imagine a woodland and a wildfire rips through it, if you've got a landscape that's functioning in an ecological way, in a way that works for wildlife, what will then happen over time is the species in the surrounding area will move back in. But if that woodland is isolated in the landscape, because all of the other landscape around it is degraded for wildlife, when you have that freak event that burns the wood to the ground, the species don't recolonize because they can't. And that then pushes other species further to the brink because you get local population extinctions. And that can happen again and again until eventually species become extinct. So we're at a bit of a crossroads now. Over the last 50 years, we've worked hard within the nature conservation sector, and thanks to the hard work of volunteers, lots of stuff has been going on. But actually, during that time, we've still been seeing the decline and loss of species, and we're now moving to a point where we are facing the next global extinction of wildlife. If we carry on doing what we're doing, we will continue to lose species. And if I stay in this sector for the rest of my career, I'll retire and be able to say that I oversaw the extinction of 15% of species on Earth, which will be a horrendous achievement at the end of my working life. The alternative is that actually we up our game. And actually the Wildlife Trust wants to up its game to a level to actually bring back our wildlife. We don't want to be conserving and preserving what we've got anymore. It's not enough to do that. We need to take it to the next level and to bring wildlife back. So how do we step up to respond to the nature and climate crisis? Well, the Wildlife Trusts are championing a new campaign, a new way of working, which is aimed at ensuring that 30% of the land area will be supporting nature's recovery by 2030. And the great idea around this is that it's scalable. So the 30% is UK land and sea, but actually it's also applicable to Warwickshire, it's applicable to Rugby, it's applicable to your garden, it's applicable to your window box, it's applicable to a farmer's field. So everybody can consider their patch and say, well, what does 30% look like? The 30% has been chosen because at a landscape scale, if you have 30% of area that is supporting wildlife in a more naturalised state, you develop the conditions that wildlife can move around, has enough food, has enough room to breed and move out into the landscape. Anything below that, you start to get disjointed ecological processes, and that's when wildlife starts to suffer and then eventually starts to become extinct. So we need to get back up to 30%. The obvious question from that is, well, where are we at now? Luckily in Warwickshire, we have a lot of data. We have been working studying the data for over 20 years now, and we have got excellent mapping data that shows us where all the natural habitats are across the landscape. And we can tell where the woodlands are, where the wetlands are, where the grasslands are, and where the marshlands and all the other habitats, all the other types of land use, urban areas, arable, farmland and things like that. And what we're able to do by using that data and using other data from local authorities, from agri-environment schemes and forestry schemes, is we can make an assessment about our current position. And unfortunately, our current position is not very good. So Rugby Borough Council, for example, if you look at the whole land area across Rugby Borough Council, about 10% is actually supporting nature's recovery at the moment, which means there's a long way to go if we need to get up to 30% by 2030. So Warwickshire Wildlife Trust is leading the way in trying to kickstart this process. In March, we started our largest ever fundraising appeal, trying to support financial income generation to turn the tide and bring our nature back. The good news is that we'd already raised £1.5 million of the £3 million target we're aiming for, thanks to generous support from businesses and from legacies, people leaving money in their will. And since our appeal launched in March, we've actually raised £50,000 from further public generosity. And we're aiming to use that money to buy new land, and we're specifically going to buy land to try and support nature's recovery, but also deliver climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and providing more access to local green space for people to enjoy, because all of our sites are open to the general public. So what sort of habitat will we create? Well, because the data we have helps us understand where things are, we can focus the best habitat creation in the best places for the wildlife that's already in that area. So, for example, if we've bought some land or acquired some new land near existing woodland, we can plant trees next to it to expand the overall area of woodland. And then the species that are already living in that woodland can move out to the new woodland that we've created. Likewise, if we acquire some land near the river, we might create some new wetlands, some new ponds or marshland, which will increase the overall area for species like otter and kingfisher and the species that use wetland environments. And the same with wildflower meadows. There's a lot of talk in the news at the moment about rewilding and the fact that we don't actually have to do anything to help nature, which is a bit misleading. And rewilding has its place, and the role of natural regeneration has its place, but so does habitat creation. So we're going to use the best of both worlds and choose what's most appropriate in what situation. Sometimes we'll do habitat creation using volunteers, and other times we might let natural regeneration help us along the way. And underpinning all of that will be data. And the best thing about this data is that everybody can access it. We share it regularly with the local authority. Rugby Borough Council has this data to help make informed decisions around where it should allocate housing and other things like that, because it knows where the best sites are for nature conservation. It helps us at a national scale and at a local scale try and spatially plan, so we can consider some species travel over huge areas and they need linkages and corridors in the landscape. So by looking at the data, we can identify where the gaps are and where the best places are. We should be creating new habitat to create stepping stones in the landscape or to join things up. We're going to target land of low productivity because we recognise that actually our population is growing and we still need to grow food, and farmland is important. So we're going to be looking at things like golf courses that are not viable, farmland that perhaps is regularly flooding, or land that's been impacted by development such as HS2, where a farm might have been cut in half and is no longer easy to manage as it used to be. So in short, what we're going to try and do is manage the existing 65 nature reserves that we already have, upscale the help and support that we provide to other people to manage their land, and create new wildlife havens. And we feel that through that collective action, we're going to move a long way towards this 30 by 30 target. But how do you tip the balance for nature and climate? so that it goes in the other direction? And is there a positive tipping point that can create momentum for behavioural change that actually leads to action? Alex was talking really well earlier about the fact that lots of people care about climate change, but actually the number of volunteers is quite low. Well, we know a lot within the nature conservation sector about the value of the natural environment, and the councillor in his introduction gave a really good overview as to actually the role that nature plays beyond just it's nice to look at. It's good for health and well-being. It's actually really good for the economy, and it provides a lot of other opportunities and links in. But there's also an imbalance. Depending on your social background and a lot of other factors, your access to green space is not necessarily the same as somebody else. And some children don't access green space as much as they do other things. So there's about a levelling up that's required within terms of access to nature, and an opportunity for us to try and work with other people to break down some barriers so that everyone can benefit from wildlife. We also know that actually a key part of it is turning values into action. So studies show that a lot of people care about the natural environment, but actually if you then look at the number of people that take action in their own home, that number starts to deplete quite significantly. And then actually the number of people that are taking conservation actions or volunteering on the ground is even less. So what we need to do is to try and break down some of these barriers, as has already been talked about today, and find ways of enabling and empowering people to take action in their local area. And we've been looking at research within the Wildlife Trust movement, and it's not actually as scary and daunting as you think it might be. So a lot of studies around behaviour change have highlighted a very similar pattern, whether you look at cigarette smoking, whether you look at plastic use, or a range of other different sort of societal challenges. Actually, studies show that if you can get just 25% or 1 in 4 people to take action, that starts to tip the balance, and then the majority look at them and follow, and it becomes a social norm. So if we can get just 1 in 4 people to take action for wildlife, then it starts to become a social norm that is more accepting, and less people have an issue over not mowing a green space or the front lawn, or planting trees on the street of the road that they live on. And then it becomes, well, that's how we always work. So that's our ambition, to enable 1 in 4 people to take action. And we're calling that Team Wilder. Put simply, it's more people on nature's side. The people each bring pieces of the jigsaw together, and together that jigsaw helps to create the conditions for nature's recovery. So what would Team Wilder consist of? Well, it's all these organisations, because the Wildlife Trust can't do this on its own, and all these organisations are consisted of people. And then there's the general community. So everybody can take action in their own home, whether they've got a window box or a garden or a farm or a local authority green space. Everyone can make space for nature. And the great thing about 30 by 30 is that we're not saying that 30% can only be solely used for nature. It can still grow food in a farming context. It can still be part of a park that allows you to walk your dog or go there with the kids. But it's really important that it genuinely is high quality natural habitat to support our native wildlife. And if we did do that, what would a wilder Warwickshire look like? Well, if we look at the map of what Warwickshire currently consists of, Warwickshire Wildlife Trust nature reserves, our 65 nature reserves, cover 0.4% of the county. So if our ambitious targets are reached and we end up securing an extra 1,000 hectares of new land, we'll be directly managing a lofty 1% of the whole county, which is still a long way off 30%. But we're working at a landscape scale and have done for a long time now. We've got 3 landscape scale projects where we work in partnership with a range of other stakeholders and local communities. But even at that scale, we're only actually hitting 11% of the county. So we're still way off what we need to, and that's why we're not having the impact we need to reverse nature's decline. And if you just quickly contrast that with, say, farming, agricultural land covers 70% of Warwickshire. So it's absolutely crucial and obvious that we need to work in partnership with other people to help solve the ecological crisis. So all of those organisations, farmers, local authorities, businesses, schools, universities can all play their part. So in summary, what we're going to be working on over the next 10 years is to create a Team Wilder that will put more people on nature's side, enable more action for wildlife, and therefore create more space for nature. And the best thing about that is it not only delivers for nature, but it also delivers for the climate crisis. It's far more efficient economically to invest in nature than it is to do climate mitigation in other ways. And at the same time, that will deliver human health benefits, will deliver benefits for health and well-being, mental and physical, and make Rugby and the surrounding area a nicer place to live. Thank you very much. That's my slides.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'll now ask Dan to read out a selection of the questions and the comments which have come through during your presentation.
Thanks, Seb, and thanks, Ian. That was genuinely fascinating, and I think it's reflected in the number of questions that it's perhaps generated. So we may have to work to answer some of them outside of this meeting. But if I start with a question from Emma Crane, who's asked, what role does farming have to play in helping to address the biodiversity crisis? How can local communities work with farmers to help improve our local habitats and soil health?
Thanks very much, Dan. That's a great question. So I think farming gets a lot of bad press for its impact on the natural environment, and we're very keen to point out that it's farming policy rather than the farmers themselves that have created the situation that we're in. So the agricultural sector is a big driver for the impact on nature, and that's mainly due to the response since the Second World War. So after the Second World War, we needed to grow more food ourselves to feed our growing population, and the intensification of agriculture resulted in an impact on wildlife because we used more chemicals and we intensified the way we were managing the land. And as a result of that, farmland species and species that have used farmland have been significantly impacted. But it's not all bad news. In recent times, we've been working now for quite a while with local farmers across the patch, and there's some great examples of how farmers have integrated natural processes into their farming system and supported nature and made space for nature on their land. There's a lot of new ideas coming forward now around organic farming and regenerative farming that a lot of farmers are embracing. What we need now is the legislation and the policy to support that. And we're going through a process, obviously, in a post-Brexit era, where we've got two key pieces of legislation that are coming through. The new Environment Act, which is going to be a new legislation relating to the natural environment, and the new Agriculture Act, which is going to be directed at farming policy. Both of those need to have really strong, robust set of policies that enable farmers and others to make decisions that are enshrined in law, and that will help improve even further. At a local level, you can definitely make space for nature in your garden. Soil health is really important, and nature, if you've got a companion planting and doing wildlife gardening, can really help the need to remove the use of chemicals in your own garden. We've got lots of fact sheets and things on our website, so I direct anybody to have a look at that if they haven't already.
Thanks, Ian, and it's great to hear of that individual level action that's possible, and I do look forward to exploring the new Environment Act when it comes out, and possibly linking in with your organisation to make sure that we do that. Have several comments from Mr. Manel, again very supportive, but he raises a very valid point about Severn Trent project at the moment, which seeks to provide an opportunity for greening our local area, and he asks about the council's involvement in that. And just to cover that one off myself, actually, Severn Trent are currently looking at a Commonwealth Games legacy forest project, which seeks to support the Games by having a carbon neutral legacy, offsetting 240,000 tonnes of carbon. And with that, they'll deliver 2,022 acres of legacy forest and provide a green legacy for the local area. And just to confirm, really, for the avoidance of doubt, that our Chief Officer for Leisure and Wellbeing actually is leading our work in relation to this. We are in discussion with Severn Trent about what we can do locally, and as you rightly point out, there are some challenges, and not least the fact that large tracts of lands are needed, but we are working absolutely with Severn Trent to see how we can support that. Emma Tiller asks a very good question, and I look forward to the answer to this one. And it's a question for the Wildlife Trust, so it's with you, Ian. Is what would you like to see Rugby Borough Council doing to support this vision?
That's a great question, Emma. Thank you for asking that. I mean, from our perspective, as I said throughout the presentation, we're really keen to work in partnership. There's a few ways in which we can do that. We're exploring with some other local authorities about land that they own that perhaps they want to look to support biodiversity net gain or increase the amount of nature on their land with. And we're looking at having discussions over whether we could enter into some more partnerships with them. We already work in partnership with Rugby Borough Council on a number of sites, and that's been a long-standing partnership that's worked really well with the Parks Department, and we're very keen to carry on that. I think we would be keen as well to consider how the natural environment can be better integrated across policy. Because one of the challenges that the natural environment has is that sometimes it's put in a box where that's an area of work that is delivered with the natural environment, and when we're thinking about planning or whether we're thinking about education or roads or other things, that's not about the natural environment, and sometimes decisions can be made in isolation. So we're very keen to try and support all the local authorities and businesses to have that joined up and considered approach, because then, as I said in my talk, the natural environment can deliver multiple outcomes for different agendas, and because of the way a lot of organisations work, funding and finance tends to be boxed in certain areas. But actually, if we can do some joined up thinking, we can achieve a lot more. We can tackle the climate crisis, we can help with some of the health and social crises that we're also finding, and the natural world can play a big part in all of those.
Thanks, Ian. And I think we've got time for one more question, but before we do, if I just ask Councillor Lowe to come in with his observations on that point.
Yeah, I'd just like to, I guess, just reaffirm our commitment to working with you, really, Ian. I mean, as you said, we are already working together, and that's undoubtedly a positive thing. But there's a hell of a lot more that we can and should be doing, and we'd be absolutely delighted to explore with you what more we can do in terms of addressing some of these issues. It was a fascinating presentation, and really very thought-provoking indeed. So we hope to take our dialogue even further and see what we can do more together over the coming years.
Thanks, Seba. And then just recognising that we've overrun, and again reaffirming my commitment to answer every question that's been asked in due course. But the last question that we can fit in today, I think, is from Councillor Jim Ellis, who makes the point that our inner town communities have a disconnected relationship to natural spaces. How can inner city spaces contribute to the 30-30 concept? I think that's with you, Ian, first of all.
Thank you. Yeah, another great question. Really, I'm so pleased with the level of thought that's gone into the questions. Actually, it shows that people care. I think from our side, that all of our agenda moving forward is very much a holistic approach, thinking about everything, urban spaces just as much as rural. What we don't want to create is wildlife havens out in the sticks that nobody can get to. We need nature to be a part of everybody's everyday life. And part of the disconnect with nature in urban areas is because the way in which town planning has evolved over the last few years has reduced the liability of having trees around, and has thought about managing urban areas in times of weather where maybe they don't want mud everywhere, which is understandable from some circumstances, but then moves us to a point all of a sudden that our urban spaces are completely detached from the natural environment. There are some great examples. Bristol is a great example of a city in the country that's leading the way in terms of how it's integrating the natural environment in a way that still creates accessibility for a range of different people, but just makes the city so much better as a place to be. And what they've found there is that the economic benefits of investing in a natural environment actually really benefit the town. So it leads to things like increased dwell time. So from a shopper or a cafe's perspective, you'd much rather sit outside and stay in the town centre for longer than nip in and get your shopping. If you can sit in a nice area that perhaps the trees are shading on a hot day so that you can get out of the way of the sun, or a nice environment that's pleasant to look at. So the environment can play a role for multiple ways.
Thanks, Ian. That's a great answer, and I'll hand back to Seb in case he has anything to add, and if not, to move on through the remainder of the agenda.
I think the only thing I would say, Ian, is that I think I agree wholeheartedly with what you just said. I think it is right to look at these things holistically. We referenced earlier that we're looking at a town centre spatial strategy which covers our urban area, and I'd very much like to see, and indeed fully expect, these kind of considerations to form a key part of that spatial strategy, because it's not just right for environmental reasons, as you quite correctly say. It's also right for a whole load of other reasons as well. So yeah, I think we're all on the same page. I think on that, there's a lot to do, but I think we all recognise that, and we're all very up for doing it. And that's I think then my cue to move on to back to Dan. Have we got time for one more question, Dan, or are we running out of time now?
I think we probably are running out of time. There was a really good question from Carrie actually about publishing tree protection orders and where they are. Just to assure you, Carrie, there is no secrecy around that, and if that's something that we're able to take forward as an action from this meeting, I'm more than happy to follow that up with our officers and see if that's something we can do.
Absolutely. And just once again, before we wrap up, I would just like to say that there have been many questions today, which is an encouraging sign in terms of the level of engagement. We do commit to responding to all of the questions that have been asked, although we haven't had time to do so verbally over the course of this conference today. So that concludes our presentations then, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank all 4 of our excellent speakers for giving up their time to come and talk to us today. Each of the presentations were outstanding and gave perspectives that I know I'll be reflecting on and acting on myself. We very much appreciate your time and will certainly benefit from everything that we've heard. I'd like to give some further thought to next steps and ask for all of your input on this. We talk a lot about the issues of climate change. We all, I think, agree we need to do something about it, but I'd really like to see now some concrete actions coming out of this and other events. Some initial thoughts I've had include, do we need to run some workshops or focus groups further exploring the themes that have been discussed today? And if so, what form should they take? We will develop our internet presence through the delivery of a climate change microsite. We will be using this to promote the work of our partners across all sectors and to offer further advice to our residents. Again, if you have any thoughts on what this should include and how you'd like your organisation to be involved, do please let us know. It occurs to me as well, we may need a follow-up event here. I know there are further themes that we need to discuss, themes like the role of parish councils, sustainable development, climate change mitigation, and of course waste management. We will also, as I think we said earlier, be consulting in the next few months on our own climate change strategy, and I really urge every participant here to comment on this, to get involved in the consultation. And finally, I'm really interested in this idea of a citizens panel and the role that could play. So, you know, very much let's work together to establish one and get that going. That's something that we'll be looking at as a council immediately as a result of this. So if anybody has any further thoughts on what our next step should be, please share these via the channels with which I'm sure you're now very familiar. Dan, just before we wrap up, can I just check if there's any further suggestions coming in from the Q&A chat?
There are, and I'm sure I'll capture them. Just a couple of key points that I've picked out. It's the role of the council in facilitating further collaboration and discussions was one of the very early comments. The point about a demonstrator or facsimile or public space where we can actually show people the technology and the environmental projects that are on offer and how can we help to facilitate that. I think that's one we've committed to taking forwards. There's also the point about the conduit to the voluntary and community sector, and we take that first of all as a council, but secondly we'll progress that with the infrastructure organisation for the third sector, Warwickshire Carver, and how they can help us to facilitate that particular role. So there's lots for us to follow up. Excellent.
And just to reiterate the point, I see our principal role in all of this, aside from all the practical things that we have to do, is acting as that conduit. You know, we can't solve this crisis by ourselves, but what we can do as the local authority is acts as the conduit for information and coordination of actions that we can all collectively take. And that's one of the big takeaways for me today. So in that case, then all that remains is for me to thank you all for your attendance at today's summit. As I said throughout the session, we can't be successful in addressing these issues unless we're all engaged as equal partners. We all agree something needs to be done, so we need to be jointly agreeing the issues and jointly delivering the solutions. Genuinely, I believe that today can be the start of a journey that we can all make together, and that by doing so, the rewards of our efforts will be greater and genuinely sustainable into the future. So I really look forward to continuing the discussion and to progressing on our shared movement. Very excited by everything that I've heard today and look forward to doing some really great things here in Rugby. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance.